Is it recording?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Ben, for the introduction, and thank you to Rich for setting this up, and to the Ethnoecology Club, and especially to my friend Rick Stepp, Professor Rick Stepp, who unfortunately is traveling, couldn't make it here, but he helped make it happen. And to all of our guests on Zoom as well, especially Robin Wright, a dear friend from work that we've done, both of us have done in the Rio Negro. And thanks to everyone for coming on a Thursday, on a slow Thursday afternoon, I'm assuming, because lots of people came. I'm really thankful for that. So let me just start my timer here. Krut is a Kayapo chief from the village of Aucre, and he's also a shaman. And I visited his village in February of last year. The village, because of the COVID pandemic, indigenous villages all over Brazil and Peru were closed to outsiders because of the risk of contagion. And the Kayapo village of Aucre was no different. And I've been planning to go back there to continue my research with Kayapo filmmakers on Kayapo odor categories, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And I couldn't go back because of the pandemic. Finally, in early February of last year, I was able to go back to the village and was able to speak with Chief Krut. And the whole village had been afflicted by COVID early on in the pandemic. And one night, he was very, very sick. His mother died. His mother died of COVID, and he was very sick of COVID. And one night he was smoking his tobacco pipe and dreamed. And during the dream, the spirits showed him a plant, a tree that said, you can use this tree and bathe yourself in it and you'll get better. And so he tried it out, and he took there was one new tree. It was a tree with a bark that's very odorous. And he mixed it with other plants, these odorous vines that the Kayapo use, that they used to treat cold and stuff, and he started bathing himself with it. And he got better. And so he told everyone in his village and people in other villages, this stuff really works. And they call it the vaccine now. And so everyone in the village bathed themselves with the plant from the dream and the other plants that they use. And it helped them get through COVID. And they also practiced what we call social distancing. They went off, each family sort of went off into their gardens far away from the village so that it would be less contagion. When people would get sick, they would go out they would stay away from the main village. And so the Kayapo, during the pandemic, they enacted their own social distancing measures that they know from ages past when diseases would come. And this particular shaman mixed existing knowledge of medicinal plants and then this new knowledge that came from his dream to create this, what they call the COVID vaccine, which they use to treat themselves of the COVID symptoms and to prevent COVID. And as I said, only one elderly woman died, his mother, and other than that, they did fine with the pandemic. And this I was already doing research on odor categories among the Kayapo and other indigenous peoples. And this particular episode highlighted to me even more the importance of odors for Kayapo medicine. And here's Krut demonstrating there's a whole group of plants that are vines with strong odors that they use for different illnesses, usually coughs and fevers and illnesses like that. And these vines that have these really sort of sharp or acrid or aromatic odors that they use to treat multiple illnesses. There's 8 or 10 different vine species, different families, different species they use, and they're all odorous. But it's not only for medicines that these odorous plants are important. On the right, this is a vine that the Kayapo use to stop the rain. They say when it's raining really hard, lots of thunder, it's about lots of wind, it's about to tear off the house roofs. They say you think that it's this vine that has this almost like almondy, really strong almondy odor, and they scrape a bunch of this vine and they burn it in a big fire, and they say it sends the clouds away. Now the Kayapo are very famous for their feather headdresses. They have this incredible feather art, but in order to sort of as a social control on they obviously have to kill birds to get feathers. So they raise lots and lots of parrots in the village to get feathers. But sometimes when they have a big demand, like for a certain rituals coming up and need lots of feathers, they do go out and sometimes on occasion hunt parrots. But only certain men are allowed to hunt parrots. And the men who hunt parrots have a restricted diet. There's certain parrot hunters, and there's certain animals that they can't eat because it takes away their ability to hunt parrots. And so the man on the right is named Kuroi. He is a parrot hunter. He's one of the few parrot hunters in the village. And as I was talking to him, I was asking about, different foods that he ate. And I was asking about, what about this? And what about this fish? What about this? And for several kinds of animal, he said, I can't eat that. Like he says, snake meat, I can't eat snake meat. It's got ke. And ke is this word they use to describe the odor of like raw fish or raw blood, it's an unpleasant, raw, meaty odor. And certain animals that have this ke odor, he says he can't eat them because he would lose his ability to hunt macaws for these feather crowns. So as I've studied this aspect of plants and odors in the Amazon, I go back to this early paper by Werner Wilbert, who's a German Venezuelan anthropologist. And he's working with the Warao Indians in Venezuela. He talks about in their illness and ethnobotanical concepts, how odors can be both pathogenic and therapeutic agents. And he calls this the pneumatic illness concepts, the idea that the illnesses and odors can exert this invisible influence at a distance that can cause harm in the case of illnesses, or that can heal. Now, in the Peruvian Amazon, there's a whole series of plants called pusanga. I don't know if anyone's ever been in Peru. And pusanga is, you find this anywhere in Lima, in all the big cities, and it's a whole art of love potions, love filters that comes out of Amazonian indigenous knowledge, and it's called pusanga. I was talking with Bill Ballet, the famous ethnobotanist from Tulane, and he says, "Oh, I wonder if that word comes from puhan." Puhan is a Tupi-Guarani root that refers to poisons, and so poisons, plants, poisons. So the idea is that this pusanga, it's everywhere in Peru today. It's this science of using plants and mostly odorous plants, not only odorous plants, but mostly fragrant plants to attract members of the opposite sex. And so I've been working with the importance of odors and other sensory properties in medicinal plants for a long time. Actually, my doctoral dissertation. Many of you out there are doctoral students. This was my doctoral dissertation research many years ago in Peru, and I was working with two different indigenous groups that live in basically the same region. They're neighbors. They live right next to each other, and yet they're very, very different. They speak different languages belonging to different language families. I mean, they're as different from one another as Chinese and German in terms of their language, and their culture is very different. And as I was studying this, they live in southern Peru, near sort of in the vicinity of, in Manu National Park, kind of in the vicinity of Cusco, Machu Picchu. It's that part of Peru, southeastern Peru, in where the Andes falls into the Amazon. It's famous. If anyone's heard of Fitzcarraldo, there's a famous film by Werner Herzog about this rubber baron who crossed from one river system into the other across a mountain. This is Manu. The Isthmus of Fitzcarraldo, where he brought the rubber boat across the mountain, was actually happened in Manu. This is, of course, Klaus Kinski in the Werner Herzog film. But this is the region where this is literally where, right here is where Fitzcarraldo took the boat in the Ucayali River into the Manu River. So I was working with these two different indigenous peoples, the Machigenga, who speak an Arawakan language, a big important language family in the Amazon, and then the Yaminawa or Nawa or Yora, who speak Panoan languages, very different language family. You can see they're very different looking people, very different customs and habits. And so as I was studying their medicinal plants, ethnobotanists study, you go and ask, well, what is this plant and what do you use it for? And then you identify it in a herbarium. With all of that I did, but in addition to that, I was interested in understanding what is it about this plant that makes it effective for healing this illness. And what and when I was asking these questions, what I found listening to people is that often, almost in most cases, there's some sensory property the plant has: the taste, the odor, the texture, the color, sometimes even a sound that it makes. And that we tend to think of, oh, indigenous people learn medicinal plants by trial and error. They just go out and they try everything and they find what works. What I discovered was that's not actually the case. They had a very clear theory of what causes an illness and what makes an illness enter a body. And they had also this very clear theory about how different pathogenic agents respond to these sensory properties in plants to get them out of the body. And so going back and forth between the Machiginga and the Yora or Nawa over many months of fieldwork, I started to detect a pattern in the differences between the way they understand illnesses and use plants to treat them. And so basically, in Machiginga plant medicines, there's bitter, astringent, caustic, and toxic plants are very, very important in the way that they ascribe medicinal efficacy to plants. And so when you take taste properties, which are mostly bitter, and irritation is like anything that makes the skin burn, or chili peppers, things like that. You take those two characteristics together, and you get basically half of all the medicinal plants in the Machiginga pharmacopoeia of several hundred plants, 300 or so plant medicines. According to them, have some sort of strong taste or irritating properties. And as I interview people about where illnesses come from, I discovered that a lot of the illnesses, the way Machiginga understand lots of illnesses, is that they come from worms. Now they understand about intestinal worms, and so they say if you get intestinal worms, it makes your stomach hurt, you get diarrhea. But the word is tsomany, and tsomany refers to earthworms, intestinal worms. But there's another kind of worm they say it's also tsomany. They say, like when you get a toothache, you got there's this tiny little invisible worm that's biting your tooth, and that's what makes it hurt. Or when you get a skin infection or an eye infection, they say there's these tiny little worms. You can't see them, but there's tiny little worms that are there eating away at your flesh, which makes it swell and makes it get pus and so on. And so this concept of tsomany, of worms, is not just about intestinal worms. It's almost like our concept of microbes, or these invisible pathogenic agents, but they have a physical presence in the body. And then a whole other series of illnesses are caused by spirits that invade the body. And the idea in this sort of preeminent importance of strong, toxic, bitter, astringent, irritating plants is that they poison the body. And so the idea is that they say that when you have these worms in your body and you put a very peppery plant or a very bitter plant on that place in your skin that's full of those worms, those microbes, they say the microbes react, so many react to the plant just like we would. Like if you like really hot chili peppers or really bitter plant, it makes them jump back in surprise. It scares them, it hurts them. And so if you put the right amount of these toxic plants in your body, not enough to kill you, but enough to hurt or kill the pathogenic particles, they leave the body. And this is, what we call an allopathic model of medicine. It's the same. It's sort of like the principle in Western medicine, where you poison the body to heal it of illnesses. And 33% of Machiginga medicines are ingested. And this sort of model of basically you have to put up with pain. This is an example in this photograph is a leishmaniasis disease. Leishmaniasis, or Uta, is a tropical disease, very common in this part of Andean Peru. I've had it as well 3 or 4 times, 3 times actually. And they use these very bitter plants to treat them, and it gets better. And I've had it twice. You take, 20 days of antimony, like, heavy metals into your veins, like mercury. It's like mercury, arsenic. It's very toxic treatment that predates antibiotics. And I'd had it twice before and been hospitalized. I was like, I'm going to go for the Machiginga medicine. So the third time I got leishmaniasis, I used the Machiginga medicine and it worked. And I've never had it since. And so, and when they were treating with it, they put on this really hot, bitter sort of, heated up this plant really hot, put it on like that, and said, nope, you can't show pain. If you show pain, you won't get better. So in addition to this allopathic model and this idea of toxicity, the Machiginga have this very stoic ethos where you have to sort of withstand pain and not express pain. And this also comes up in their shamanism. The Machiginga use tobacco. Lots of indigenous peoples throughout South America use tobacco, smoke tobacco, but the Machiginga, they use tobacco snuff, and they blow this really powerful, painful tobacco snuff up each other's nostrils. And you can see here, that's katsi. Katsi means painful. Katsi refers to chili peppers. It refers to bone pain, physical pain, and it also refers to the painful sensation of tobacco snuff. And this idea of the pain of the tobacco snuff is directly related to the concept of shamanism. The Machiginga word for shaman is seri. The word for the Machiginga word for tobacco shaman, the word for shaman is seri pigari, the one intoxicated by tobacco. So shaman and tobacco are synonymous, they're the same thing. And so the idea is that a shaman who's making tobacco, he puts his soul, as he's making that tobacco, it's not just a physical process, there's a spiritual process. And as he mixes and grinds the tobacco, he imbues the tobacco with his soul. And the more powerful the shaman, the more painful his tobacco. Now, the Machiginga also use ayahuasca. Probably everyone's heard of it. They probably sell it down the street these days. It's all over the place. And ayahuasca is this very, very bitter vine. It's actually a combination of two plants to activate the psychoactive effects. The Machiginga word for it is kamanampi, which just means vomiting medicine. They're very straight to the point. And they describe this plant. Where does its power come from? The healing power of ayahuasca comes from its bitter taste, kepishiri, and its toxic properties, kepigari, which means toxic. The Machiginga word for intoxication, drunkenness, just means poison, kepigari, poison. Now, and I've been working with the Machiginga for 3 or 4 years, studying their ethnobotany. When I went to do a comparative study with their neighbors and former enemies, they had been at war with each other for most of the 20th century until the 1980s when the Yoruba got contacted. And they lived just like 30 miles away. They don't live very far apart. And yet the logical system for understanding medicinal plants was very, very different, almost not diametrically opposed, but very different. And so, whereas with the Machiginga, about 50% of plants have some sort of strong, bitter, toxic, noxious property. For the Yoda, it's visual cues. 32% of plants have some visual cue that tells them, you say, why does this plant heal? Because it has spines, because it's got red sap, because it has the shape. And one of the most important categories of medicine for the Yoda is this thing called huidarao. Now, Rao is an interesting word. It's in Yoda and it's in all the Panoan languages, some cognate of Rao or Dao. Rao means illness, but it also means medicine. They're the same. Illness and medicine are the same thing. And so the word huidarao means wasp illness, but it also means wasp medicine. And so the idea behind this, and the wasp illnesses, it's a large category. There's multiple illnesses, and they're illnesses that they say are similar to the effects of being stung by different wasps. And so they say some wasps sting you and give you a headache. Some wasps sting you and make you vomit blood. Some wasps sting you and make their joints swell. Some wasps sting you and it makes your stomach hurt. Some wasps sting you and makes your heart ache. And so they say that a person gets an illness, a rash or a headache or red blood in their eyes or painful chest, and they say, this must be from one of those wasp species. And so they go into the forest and they try to find a plant that is owned by the same wasp species that caused the illness. And the way they identify these things is mostly by spines and by most of the wasps. There's about 30 different species of plants that are called huidarao, of different kinds of, this wasp species, that wasp plant, this wasp plant. And they almost all of them have either spines and or red latex, which reflects the wasp's sting, right? And so the idea is they describe it like this. And at first it was hard for me to tell, are they talking, they say this, this illness comes from the wasp. And did the wasp sting them? Oh yeah, the wasp stung them. But where was it a physical wasp that they got? Oh, no. It came from the plants. So what I came to understand is that these wasp spirits inhabit different plants. And just like sometimes in the forest, you walk near a wasp nest, you don't even touch it, and the wasps attack you. And they say it's just like that. It's like these wasp spirits inhabit this plant, and you're walking by it, minding your own business. You're not doing anything, but they attack you for no reason. They make you so sick. And so when you get afflicted by a wasp illness, you have to go and find the wasp plant. Huidarao, you get huidarao, you get the wasp illness. You have to go find huidarao, the wasp medicine that made you sick. And then there's another example of this, which is shakorao. Shako is this millipede that walks. They say it walks all over things. And I actually talked to a scientist who says this millipede actually does have toxic secretions. They say the Shako millipede walks around stuff, it gets on your food, it gets on your clothes, and you ingest it and it makes you sick. And the plants that treat the Shakorao plant that treats the Shakorao illness, they're vines that are rubbery and have long hair, so they look like millipedes. And this is what you call like a homeopathic model, not homeopathic in the sense very small amounts. You know, homeopathy, we take very small amounts. Not in that sense, but homeopathic in the sense that like treats like. So the medicine and the illness are the same. And so you take the medicine to draw the illness out. And this explained to me why, what really struck me is, remember the Machiginga ingests 33% of their medicines, the Yora only ingests 4% of the medicines. And I was really, at the beginning, I was like, they don't, bitterness was just not an issue for them. They don't care about bitter plants at all. Like, the Machiginga, that's all they care about. How is it possible? And then it struck me. Most of their plants, 75% of their plants are applied externally as plasters. And what a guy who spoke Spanish explained is it's like imam. It's like a magnet. You scrape the plant, you warm it up, and you put it on the place that hurts, and it's like a magnet. It draws out the illness by means of similarity. So that's why you would never ingest the plant that's causing your illness, because then you'd be ingesting the illness. There's shakorao, and so the vines that they used to treat this are these Asclepiad vines that are all Asclepiadaceae that are all flexible and have long hairs. And this one was one of my favorite ones. This is called huibiti, and they say it treats conjunctivitis because it looks like it literally looks like an afflicted red eye. Now, as I said before, the Machiginga and the Yora were at war for most of the 20th century. Basically what happened is Fitzcarraldo came through, he wiped out all the indigenous people who were living there, and then when the rubber room ended, the Machiginga and the Yora, who were living in slightly different places, they came in to fill that demographic void left by the Indians, the indigenous people who were murdered, and then the rubber tappers, and they came into contact with another, and they were at war for most of the 20th century. The Yora were contacted, quote unquote, forcibly contacted in 1986. And this terrible set of illnesses, mostly respiratory illnesses, whooping cough and flus and malaria attacked them. And almost half of their population died in the first 5 years of contact. It was a very traumatic experience. And they say it was rauchaka. It was a bad illness. They say it was just like fish poison. Like when you put fish poison in the water, all the fish died. There was this poison in the air, and it killed all of us off. And so, in 1986, when I first went to Peru, it was the first time the Yora were coming down the river. They had colds. They'd been isolated for almost a century, and then all of a sudden they were contacted by loggers. They started getting sick. They started getting colds. And they would come down the river looking for medical help. And whenever you'd see them, they would have all of these fragrant plants stuffed in it's fragrant and sort of, they all wear these armbands right here on their armbands here, and here. And wait, someone's calling me. Turn that off. And these things were all stuffed with fragrant plants. And the first time I saw them, they were just coming down the road. I just saw them in the boats with these fragrant plants. I said, I wonder what that's for. And as I went back, 10 years later to work on this project, they believed that these fragrant plants help dispel illnesses. So when they were coming out the first time they were contacted, they were coming down the river and seeing Peruvians, mestizos, white people, they would fill their bodies up with these fragrant plants in an attempt to keep away this rauchaka, this illness that killed so many people. And then Another interesting thing about this Yora now homeopathy, as the Machiginga have encountered new diseases like tuberculosis and even AIDS, they've resorted to ever more bitter and toxic plants to fight these ever more powerful Western illnesses. The Yora, they have a different strategy. Nawa, what they call, white people are Dawa, non-indigenous people are Dawa. And so they say, Dawa Rao. That's white people illness. Dawa Rao, white people medicine. So they say that their traditional plant medicines can't treat white people illness because that's white people illness, white people medicine. They say when we get a fever, we get malaria, we go to the padre or to the missionary or to the anthropologist and get medicines because we can't treat white people illness with white people medicine. But in the shamanism, they do treat these fevers and illnesses with it. And so as they come in contact with these outside medicines, outside illnesses, the shamans have taken up this strategy of singing songs to all these objects, these hot, strong-smelling objects. And these shamanic songs, guns, gunpowder, motors, gasoline, outboard motors, car, diesel oil, diesel fuel. What these things have in common, these different exotic substances, and machines that the white people bring, they have these strong smells like gasoline, and they have this hot. They're super, super, super hot. They get hotter than if you touch your hand on a gasoline engine, it'll burn you. And so they associate the arrival of white people with this combustion, this combustion technology, combustion engine and gunpowder technology, with these new fevers, malaria, and all these high fevers that they say they didn't used to have. And so what the shaman does when a person has one of these Western illnesses that are characterized by high fever, they don't even try plant medicines. They say, we can't fix that. Dawa dao. You got to use white people medicine, white people illness. But what they do is they sing to them, and the shamans sing to them, and they sing out to the spirits of the gasoline and the motor and the gunpowder and the truck fuel and the airplanes and the helicopters. They'll sing to these hot, combustible, strong-smelling objects to gather that heat together, and then they'll blow their cooling breath onto this. They'll blow their fragrant cooling breath onto that heat to calm down the fever. So these homeopathic concepts from the plants also apply to their shamanistic traditions. And so going back to the data from my thesis fieldwork, I was comparing, what is the relative importance of each of the main chemosensory pathways? So it's taste, taste in the mouth, odor in the nose, and then irritation is that thing that, it's trigeminal nerve stimulation, it's pain, it's chemical irritation of the nerves, which it can combine elements of taste and odor like chili peppers as a separate neural pathway. Visual and tactile because of the importance of visual and tactile things. And in some plants, just why do you use this plant? It just works. There's no property to it. And you can see that there's a really different distribution. So for the Machiginga, 23% of all plants have some sort of taste property. Medicinal plants have some sort of taste property. For the Yora, less than 5% have a taste property. They don't know what it tastes like because they don't put it in their mouths. It took me a while to figure that one out. Irritation, pain, chili peppers, another 26-27% of Machiginga plants have some attributed taste irritation property. Visual tactile, the Machiginga use visual tactile sometimes, like, oh, that plant, it's got a red color, you can use it for something, it's for your blood. But you see with the Yora, it goes up to like 33% of all their plants have some sort of visual property or tactile property that explains its medicinal use. This isn't for identification. I'm not talking about how they identify the plant. I'm talking about how they explain the efficacy of that plant for certain illness. And they're, way up there, 33%, where the Machiginga have much less of that. But then when you look at odor, they're both about the same. Both of them, in the case, odors explain, 35, 40% of both. So that's the one thing that's similar, or at least the property is used. It's actually the main overall sensory property for both. not Machiginga, 34% of the plants have some odor property that they attribute to it. Not the Yora, 41%. And so for the Machiginga, about 1/4 of all the medicinal plants that they taught me are fragrant herbs that women give to babies every day to protect them from illnesses. And the idea is that hunters, their husbands go out and hunt an animal and kill it. And the animal spirit gets really mad at the hunter for killing it. And so the spirit, they say it's like a cloud. Animals have these stenches. Some animals have scent glands. They say it's kind of a musky, like a garlicky odor that animals have. And when the animal dies, its spirit comes as a cloud of this musky, gamey odor, and it attacks the hunter's baby, newborn babies, and makes them sick. They'll wake up and they'll like cry, they'll vomit, they'll get rashes. All kinds of child illnesses can be caused, even sudden child death, they say, is caused by these bad smelling animal spirits that attack them. And so the idea of these plants is that the women, for newborn babies till about 3 months old, they'll bathe the baby 3 times a day in this warm mixture of fragrant plants, different fragrant plants and sticky plants, plants that make that fragrance adhere to the body. And the idea is that it creates this fragrant force field that keeps the foul-smelling illness spirits away and protects the child from illness. And you can see how built into this cosmology, there's this idea of balance, because the hunter hunts, but then the ecosystem comes back and hunts the hunter. And so there's this concept of like ecological balance, where the cosmos itself is an ecosystem in which, human actions in the natural world get retribution in return. So one of the main uses of fragrant plants for the Machiginga is to protect babies. One of the main use for fragrant plants among the Yora is these botanical perfumes I mentioned briefly in the beginning, what they use to protect themselves from illness. And so I identified over 30 species. They call them collectively Ethnobotany. Ethnobotany actually refers to that armband they wear around their arms, but it also refers to this whole category of fragrant plants they put in the armband. The Yora, they're very preoccupied with bodily odors. They take lots and lots of baths. When you're walking around the woods with them and someone's gone, pooped or peed nearby and they smell it, they'll start blowing the nose and spitting. They got to get that out of my nose, because they say that odor of urine or feces goes into your nose and down into your stomach and makes you sick. And so you don't want it to get into your body. And so they use these fragrant plants as a way of keeping away these pathogenic odors. And the illness that's caused by inhaling urine odor, it's called isochikora. The illness is called isora, urine illness. And to treat it, there's a plant called isochikora, which means it's the plant that has the same smell as urine. And so it's a fern, and you basically rub it on your stomach. They say it smells urine, and it takes out the urine smell so you don't get sick. And the most dangerous thing is corpses that aren't buried. And because then lots of Yora died in the 1980s, there are a lot of people who weren't buried properly. And they say that improperly buried corpses come back as these kind of like zombies. They're corpse wraiths. They're rotting corpses that walk around the forest, and they're considered to be the most dangerous category of illness. If you see one of those corpse wraiths, you're not going to survive it. So this idea is that these fragrant plants help dispel illness. Now, the current project that I've been working on, I'd worked on, the sort of sensory aspects of plants with the Machiginga and the Yora. And then in Brazil, I've taken that, there's some new technologies out there. There's this kit, it's called the sniffing sticks. And it's a kit of they're like magic markers, but rather than having colors, they have odors. And people are using them around the world to study odor vocabularies in different languages. And so I got my hand on these sniffing sticks, and I started taking them to different indigenous groups to see if I could understand something about odor and odor, understandings of odor and uses of odor in different Amazonian languages and different cultures. And so I have some preliminary data where I got odor vocabulary from Machigenga, Baniwa, which is another indigenous group. Robin Wright is the world expert on the Baniwa. Hopefully he's still with us. Kayapo, who I mentioned in the beginning. And then there was a field school with some American college students. And so I took advantage of their presence to get some odor data with US college students. And these are just the overall responses. You give them these odor sticks, they don't know what's in them, and you have them smell them and you say, describe this odor. And the responses, you can see there's some interesting similarities and interesting differences in the responses. Most of these odors, it's cinnamon, it's rose, it's clove. So most of the odors in the kit are plants. So not surprisingly, most of people's responses are, oh, it's such and such a plant. It's people say it smells like cinnamon, it smells like bananas, it smells like, pineapple, whatever. And so as I categorized it, in most of the cases, about half of the cases, the different indigenous languages ascribed either some native plant or some exotic plant to describe it. But what varies, abstract terms. Most terms for odors, you say, oh, that smells lemony, it smells flowery. There's not a lot of words in English that are abstract terms that refer to odors that don't refer to anything else. It's, in fact, in English, you can hardly think of any. Indigenous languages, some indigenous languages have these, it's like, blue. What is blue? Well, blue is blue. You can't describe blue or green or yellow with reference to anything but itself. Most odor terms in English are referring to grass smell, green smell, something like that. Perfume smell. In Machigenga and in Baniwa, both Arawakan languages, curiously enough, about a third of the odor terms are these abstract odor concepts that refer to odors in a non-specific way. You can see that among US speakers, abstract terms weren't even used. No one used abstract odor terms. All the odor terms referred to things. Interesting, you see that in the Kayapo, and then especially among college students, a lot of the odor terms referred to commercial store-bought products like soap, shampoo, chocolate candy, things like that, reflecting different degrees of integration into the market economy. Some odor terms referred to animals, like that smells like such and such a fish, that smells like such and such an ant, so on like that. But one of the most interesting things I found is that this little purple slice among US college students, not a lot, but about 6% of odor terms among US college students referred to places or memories. Oh, that smells like my mother's kitchen. That smells like laundry. That smells like a laundry room. It smells like Christmas. It smells like birthday, something like that. There was this, small number, but significant, the presence of odor terms associated with memories and with holidays and with personal memories. None of the indigenous languages have this characteristic so far that I could tell. So anyway, this is something I'm working on. I'm looking at odor vocabularies in different indigenous languages to see patterns. And then what's interesting is when you explore odor as an anthropologist, you stumble upon aspects of culture that you hadn't maybe thought of before. And so I described how, among the Machigenga, the odors, the perfume plants are used to protect babies from animal illnesses, animal smells. Among the Yora, they use the perfumes to keep away bad smells from all kinds of illnesses. Among the Kayapo, there's a whole category of medicinal vines. Many different species of vines used for many things, but they all have a sort of acrid kind of penetrating odor. The Baniwa, I made this slide especially for Robin Wright because I know he'd be interested in this. Among the Baniwa, as I was working on these odor vocabularies, what kept coming up are these plants that they used to use for perfumes and soaps and shampoos and sort of like cosmetic uses. And they say back before they had shampoo and soap and so on, they had this whole suite of plants that they would use to wash their hair, wash their bodies, take away body odors. And then during the festivals, the people of the Upper Rio Negro, like the Baniwa, there's a whole rituals around different kinds of flutes, and there's one set of flutes, sacred flutes, that only initiated people can handle them and see them. The ones here aren't. These are secular. These are just the normal flutes. They're not the special sacred flutes that you couldn't photograph. And they say that when they would do these dances, the men, depending on the ritual, the men would dance, only the men, or the men and women would dance together with certain flutes, and they would adorn their bodies with these fragrant plants around their belts. This one right here is called wadiwapo, the one that's known. It's actually it's an Aureliaceae. It's the ginseng family. So they have this sort of interesting odor. So it's wadiwapo is a plant that's used in these rituals. Piamidza is a sapotacea that has a really beautiful smell. And there's these different plants that uses soap. And the idea is before these rituals, they would bathe themselves, and they put all these perfume plants, and they dance in a closed space for hours and hours, dancing and playing flutes and singing and dancing and playing. And they say that their sweat and body heat and movement would create this whole beautiful sort of cloud of odor in the longhouse. And they say they really miss that. Say, we do the rituals today, but we don't do them with those plants. It's just not the same. The older people, they would reflect back and they would remember with nostalgia just that wonderful odor of, that fragrance of these multiple plants and humans, in these rituals. And that they say that that's something that we do. We still do some of the rituals, but we've lost that odorous aspect that was so important, the perfume aspect. And so, this work that I've been doing in ethnobotany, but I've been inspired a lot by sensory anthropology. It's a subfield of anthropology that looks at cultural variation and universals and sense perception. And what anthropologists and even sensory physiologists have found is that there's this really complex interaction between physiology and culture and religious beliefs and so on, in a way that sensory experiences, especially olfactory experiences, usually we consider feces as bad, right? But for someone who grew up on a farm, the smell of manure, even horse urine, can bring back good memories, So, your response, and, things like perfumes, anyone who has a neighbor or a family member with extreme sensitivity to perfumes, some people think perfumes smell great, but other people are literally allergic to them. They can have these allergic reactions to them. So sensory perception, but especially odor, is extremely variable across cultures. And it has this interesting combination of physiology. Odor is something very visceral. That they say that the people who study the evolution of the brain say it's not so much that the nose is a frontal extension of the brain as the brain is a dorsal extension of the nose, because the nose came first. The first sensory perception was chemosensation. And so all other senses came out of that. And so our responses to odors are very visceral, and they can be shaped by, personal experiences, individual experience. Like if you eat something that makes you sick, you'll never eat it again, and cultural things. And so I think that studying odors and other sense perceptions, they give you this expanded view of the relationship between the body and the soul, and the body-soul relationships, nature-cultural relationships. It's a very interesting place to study the nature-cultural relationship through sensory perception. Because it's structured by very specific physiologies. Obviously, you have a nose. Your nose responds to molecules that go into it. And yet those responses are very culturally and even individually variable. And also in studying these indigenous concepts about odors, going beyond just the individual, the individual stories, the individual anecdotes about this plant does this, you can see that these odorous philosophy, these odorous concepts, they describe a kind of ecological philosophy. In the case of the Machiginga, the idea that the hunter goes out and hunts, he kills an animal, the animal takes revenge on his child through this musky odor. The mother has to protect the child by protecting it with these fragrant plants that come from nature. This idea of ecological feedback loops. And then in the Yora responses to new illnesses, there's this exotic illness that comes from outside with these new hot odors, they're trying to find new ways to respond to that in their culture. In the case of the Yora, they're using songs to try and heal it. In the case of the Kayapo, they're using new plants that the shaman dream to try and protect them. And so this idea that ecology is karma, the cosmos, the ecosystem gets back at you if you don't respect certain norms. And that's something that's very fundamental in indigenous cosmologies. Not so much in our cosmology, in our way of doing it. We just keep pumping CO2 into the atmosphere. And after a while, you pump all that stuff in the atmosphere, and what happens? The whole Earth now has a fever because there's so much, there's been so much industrial pollution that the Earth itself is responding now. And so this idea that the indigenous people have that odors and gaseous substances act as pathogenic agents, when you first hear about it, it sounds, oh, that's very quaint, how interesting these indigenous people believe that. But now we're living this on a planetary basis, how the release of these gases is causing the entire planet to heat up and destroying and possibly destroying ecosystems and maybe even human civilization itself. So there's a lot to be learned from these indigenous ideologies. This idea of ecological vengeance, the spirits that take vengeance in the Machiginga hunting system, those spirits are kind of like the Gaia, the ecological system itself, taking vengeance for abuse of resources. And so you can see, at the individual scale, like, oh, I hunted an animal, I got to protect my baby because nature is going to get back at me. The animals, the spirits that govern nature get back at me. But then at a societal level, these same processes happen. When you cut down too many trees, the land heats up, you don't have as much rain. And so what's going on right now in the Amazon and across the world is the destruction of these complex biosocial networks is causing all of these environmental pathologies like global warming, but also physical pandemic pathologies, as we all have just been through with COVID. It was interesting, a colleague of mine, Elsa Legru at the National Museum in Brazil, when the first news started coming out about COVID, she was in touch with her Kashinawa colleagues. She was going to do field work, she couldn't do field work, but she managed to stay in touch for a certain amount of time through WhatsApp and so on, through the internet. And she's explained, well, they say that this thing comes out of bats, China. No, now we don't even know where it came from. But one of the initial ideas was it was somehow coming from bats or pangolins. And she's trying to explain this to her Kashinawa friends. And so, oh yeah, we know about that. We've known about it all the time. There's what they call nisum, is a category of illnesses that are caused when different animals, like bats and other animals, when they feel disrupted by human activities, they take revenge and they cause these terrible fevers, and they can kill people. Rabies among them, these diseases that are associated with animal populations. When you disturb a bat population, when a bat population is stable, rabies doesn't tend to escape. The rabies is there endemic in the bat population, but it doesn't escape into the human population. It's only when human activities disturb the bat population that rabies starts popping up. And so the indigenous people, we know all about this. And what did indigenous people used to do when new illnesses would come? They would go isolate in the woods. They'd go stay at their gardens, just like the Kayapo did. So this whole idea of zoonotic diseases and the world getting back, nature getting back at us for our abuses and having to go off and hide in isolation, it's nothing new to indigenous peoples. It's something they've been practicing for hundreds of years. I don't know if any of you saw this photograph. It was a really just striking photograph. A photographer, Ricardo Stuckert, was flying in Brazil in the Amazon and came across this this longhouse of an uncontacted, isolated indigenous group, and actually landed and went and got a special helicopter with these stabilizing devices so you could take these really close-up pictures. There's a whole scandal, not a scandal, but there's a whole discussion, polemic about it, because does National Geographic have the right to disturb these people, come back like that? And these people from the region they live on the Peru-Brazil border, not very far, really very close, the same general region where I work with in Peru with the Yora people. They're almost certainly Panoan speakers. And I'd almost be willing to bet they're probably Yaminawa speakers based on the region. They're Yaminawa or Amwaka. They're very closely related culturally and linguistically to the Yaminawa, the Yora that I work with. And so this soldier, when the helicopter comes back and is flying over there, think, what is this crazy giant, dragonfly? He went and got his arrow to go kill this thing. And what did he do? He filled up his belt with plants. And I'd be willing to bet that those are fragrant plants, possibly related to the fragrant plants that the Yora use. And so, for us, this whole experience of social isolation was a new thing. It was very disruptive. It destroyed our economy. But indigenous peoples in the Amazon, and isolated indigenous peoples especially, this is how they protected themselves. The isolated peoples, indigenous peoples in the Amazon didn't have vaccines when they were first contacted. They didn't have antibiotics. And so their number one strategy for protecting themselves, beside their plants, besides their shamanism, was to go off into the forest and hide, because they knew that these illnesses for which you have no treatment, you need to protect yourself from with all these different ways. So I just like to end on that note that sort of, these processes that you see in specific case studies, they end up having a broader relevance. And even in these isolated communities who are isolating themselves to protect themselves from our diseases, perfume is all powerful. So thank you. And I hope I left some time for questions.
So we definitely have time for a few questions if anybody is nodding. Raise your hand. I have a question in relation to the species, the different cases that involve the species. The person that those species are I asked that question because in some places it's not even and in some places it's easy to introduce new and you keep having the answer that people go to in the tropics, in tropic plants and they're used to purpose. So it's not something new.
Yeah, in the case of the Machin and the Yora, where I did actually plant collecting, there was very few introduced plants yet in their pharmacopoeias. But in the years since, I've seen that garlic and ginger have really come into lots of indigenous people's repertoires, not just for cooking, but for medicine as well, because of the odor in the case of garlic and because of the peppery taste of ginger. Mango is, that's an introduced species. It's all over the Amazon that sometimes gets used medicinally as well. Mint is something that lots of indigenous people use today. So there are more and more, in some place like the Andes, I think the mixture between European and plants from other regions of South America, there's a huge percentage of the pharmacopoeia that gets taken over. In these groups, not quite so much. I think medicinal plants in these cultures, in these two places, it's still sort of a conservative knowledge repertoire. It hasn't blended as much, but when you go someplace like the Guyanas, there's a blending of African plants, Caribbean plants, Amerindian plants, European plants. So it varies a lot, the degree of incorporation of exotic species, but it's something that definitely happens. And the interesting thing is, a student of mine in French Guyana studied this. The way that new plants get incorporated into the pharmacopoeia usually follows the sensory logic of existing plants. So they'll take a plant from Africa or from Haiti because it's bitter, or they'll take a plant from like Azadirachta indica, the bitter gourd. That's very important in French Guyana now because of its bitterness, and it fits into ideologies about bitterness. And then certain fragrant plants will come into a pharmacopoeia and they'll be used in ways that are congruent with the traditional understanding of sensory properties.
Sorry, second question. Dangerous plants, areas that people identify like an area that we should because of this now, you don't notice anything like that?
There's definitely plants they say you shouldn't touch. I would, at least in what I've observed, not so much areas that you can't go into, but certain plants, like don't touch that plant. If you bother it, it will bother you back. And there's definitely concepts of certain plants that have spiritual properties that are dangerous. And you either, people in certain conditions, like for example, bamboo, that's what the Machiging use to make their arrow points. When a man's wife is pregnant, he can use his arrows to hunt, but he can't make new bamboo arrow points because they say that the arrow plant is vengeful, and they say because it has a sharp edge, it'll cut the umbilical cord and the baby will die. So there's definitely a concept of certain plants have vengeful properties, but I haven't come across a thing where they like, oh, you can't go in this area of the forest because of dangerous plants. But there's definitely certain plants that are considered to be dangerous.
Yeah. But in the Kaipo, where in the beginning when you were talking about COVID-19 and how they did use some plants to, they practice isolation and things like that, but they also use medicinal plants. Were those? Do we know? Are those plants? Do we know what it was about those plants that made them well?
I mean,
or was it? Do you have thoughts on? Were they odorous?
They were all of them. All of the COVID plants. Every single one of them had some sort of strong fragrance. There were things that were more
white man's diseases.
Yeah, in that case, they use them. They say this works. Most of the plants they already use for colds and fever and headaches. They said, well, this is like a super headache, super cold. So we're gonna take all that we got. They would literally take the new species from the dream, mixed with 4 or 5. They take everything. Let's hit it with everything we got. So they would take all of these plants. This one's for fever. This one's for cough. Let's just mix them all together and just bathe with it. And I didn't collect it. I didn't have authorization to collect it, but I got a sense of what there was a lot of the vines were Aristolochiaceae, which is Dutchman's pipe, which is it's a vine that has a real unique sort of kind of hard to describe aromatic odor. But they all had this, they all had not so much cinnamon or clovey. Some of them smelled like cloves. Some of them smelled more like I know they're hard to describe, like aromatic odors, Aristolochiaceae.
I wanted to know if you could elaborate on the abstract.
Okay. Well, for example, of all the indigenous languages that I've come across, they all have a word. They have a term, an abstract term for the smell of uncooked meat or fish or blood. And in Machiging it's Hanigarienga, in Yora it's Huia, in Kayapo it's Ku. And so it doesn't refer to anything. Like we don't have a word for it in English. We don't have a word for the smell of uncooked fish, but it's not rotten. There's another word for rotten. It's like if you leave a fish for too long, it becomes rotten. And then there's a word for rotten in all these languages. But all of them have this abstract term it's hard to translate, but it refers to ku. It's the smell of uncooked meat.
More of like a feeling or
it's not, it's something that's, you say, it's not pleasant, but it's not repulsive. Like rotten, they all have a word for rotten. Like every language has a word for rotten, and that's considered to be repulsive. It's the smell of rotten food, feces, bad stuff. Corpses, that's rotten. But ku is this interesting term that it's not pleasant, but you've got fresh fish is ku. So it's not pleasant, but it's also not bad. And then of all the language that I've studied so far, most of them have 3 or 4 abstract. They usually have one word that refers to fragrant plants, like things that are usually flowers, fruits, things that are fragrant. They almost always have a word for fragrant things. They almost always have a word for this ku, this uncooked meat, blood. They almost always have a word for rotten, bad things. But the Yora language, it's abstract odor terms. And then the rest of the odor terms, and then there's usually one for musky things, like garlicky, or the smell of game animals, the smell of peccaries, the smell of the smell of, huh?
Like pungent.
No, that's something else. No, it's a, and this we don't have, I guess in English we call it musk, but musk is a word for an animal scent gland, right? Musk. But they have an abstract term that refers to the musky, kind of, it's usually a garlicky, almost garlicky odor, but like, it's like armpit odor, like that word. There's usually a word for that. But in most of the languages, there are 3 or 4 abstract terms, and then most of the other odor terms are, say, the smell of this plant, the smell of that plant, the smell of this fish, the smell of that thing. In the Eora language, there were probably 15 abstract odor terms. There were these odor terms that describe these complex things. Like there was one that was ashol in Eora. Ashol means, they say, well, it's kind of like the smell of freshly grated corn. It's like the smell of semen. It's like the smell of certain vines when you cut them. It's like this rank vegetative odor. It's not pleasant, but it's not bad. And you find it in different places. And they say, they call that ashol. And you scrape a plant and smell it and say, what's that ashol? And it just means that sort of smell of like rank, but not unpleasant. Sort of sicky sweet that you find in certain plants, ashol. And then they have this really cool word called chico, right? I said before, iso chicorao, the plant that treats you from the smell of urine. Chico, iso means urine. Chico is an abstract odor word that refers to the odor of urine and urinous things, but it's not urine. Like in the other languages, Machigenge, you just say the smell of urine. Yeah. But in Eora, there's a specific word, chico, that refers abstractly to that urinous odor. So it's actually an important, I mean, there was this theory going back 100 years that odor is not encoded linguistically by the brain. But the problem was all of the studies that came to that conclusion were for people speaking Indo-European languages, and English, and mostly English and then French and so on. And so it was a conclusion that universally human beings can't encode odors abstractly. So that's why most odor terms are like, oh, it smells like rose, it smells like clove, it smells like this. So the idea was that the human brain cannot encode odors linguistically, so we just associate them with similar things. When people started working with other languages and other language families, they started finding these abstract odor, sometimes very elaborate abstract odor vocabularies, which kind of overturned this sort of supposedly physiological universal actually turns out to be culturally variable. It's things like, umami, that's the famous example. It's not an odor, but it's a taste. Umami is that taste texture of MMSG. We call it savory, but it's not really the same. And so umami, it's the Japanese word for the taste of MSG, monosodium glutamate, which it makes things more flavorful. And so that's an example of a word, of a taste term that we don't have a word for in English. And then in odor, there's more examples of these interesting things. And they talk about what are the limit, language, physiology, how well can language encode encode experience. It's an interesting topic.
So you can grant with that, like we have found, you think you can do like a verbal biology, sociology, and actually our society have less abstract names for cells and most of the because I got the feeling that it's like that. It's people. They're like the sense of our just through total. Because we grew up in such a sanitized environment that our sense is the
well, there's a researcher in England, Asifa Majid. She's a psychologist, but she studies odor vocabulary all over the world. And she's got a whole group of graduate students who are looking at this in Japanese, in India, in different countries, in Hungarian, and they have very interesting findings about the different numbers of abstract odor terms in different languages. And in Thailand, there's this hunter-gatherer group where they found this this large vocabulary of abstract odors. But the most interesting about that study was that when you give these 16 odor sticks to the people, and they would describe these odors using these abstract odor terms, and you compared the results between people who spoke the same language, and their results were as similar among themselves as English speakers were for colors. So they were very, very, they weren't sort of random. They had very good concepts of whatever these 15 or 16 abstract odor terms, and multiple people use them to refer to these same kinds of exotic smell. A very interesting study. But that seems to be the exception rather than rule. In the global studies that have been done so far, there's only a very few languages that have these abstract odor terms. And they tend to be from indigenous languages living in sort of isolated settings. I'm interested to go back to the Yoda, all these years later, to see if they've lost that. Because I get the sense as people are exposed to more and more different smelling things, you show them something, so that smells like, that smells like bubblegum, that smells like soap. So it seems like as Western things arrive with odors, it's like the Western capitalist odors bring like a Western capitalist ideology along with it. And it could be that helps to diminish these other. True. Chico.
Thanks, Glenn, for actually very interesting. And I just want to remind for the beginning of the presentation when you mentioned that with Nancy. So I was always bothered about the idea that all knowledge about the small plants came from trial and error. Because it makes no sense to me that they are trying everything for every kind of disease. So, but it's the mainstream explanation. Somebody could say that that ring, the shaman was connecting with some kind of ancestral knowledge that's based, utterly based on trial and error about the millennia of the relationship of human and plants. So I just want to hear from you your idea about if it's not from trial and error, from where this knowledge came from and how they are assessing this knowledge. If it's not trial and error, where they learn this kind of.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that, at least, from the work I did with the Machiging and the Yoda, they have an elaborate theory about how illnesses get in the body, what they do inside the body, and what it takes to get them out of the body. And the plants, it was only when I understood the sensory property of the plant, they say, oh, we use this plant to treat diarrhea. We use this plant to treat headache. I'm like, well, why? And then what does the plant do? And they say, well, the plant has a very fragrant odor. And when you sniff it really hard, that fragrant odor scares away the headache and sends it out. Or the plant has the spine because it's the wasp species that you're pulling out, or it's bitter and the bitterness kills the worm that's inside you. So they have theories. It's not random. It's not trial and error. They have theories about how the body works and how you fix it when it's broken. And those theories, at least in the case of the place where I was working, those theories match very closely onto certain sensory properties they're looking for. So when they go out looking for a plant to heal something, they're looking for a plant that matches, sort of that lines up with those theories of illness. And so in the case of the dream he had, it was a plant. It wasn't a new plant. It was a plant that people knew. They knew it had a certain sort of fragrant, rankish odor. It was a new use. No one had used it for that before. But who's not to say that the tobacco spirit inspired him to seek out this new plant? But it was a plant that did match their pre-existing expectations of, basically plants for headache and fever and cold among the Kayapo. They don't necessarily ingest them. For them, these illnesses have to do with things impinging on the head, And so when you bathe your head in these fragrant plants, whatever's going on in the head, it helps to pull it out, it helps pull the spirit, the animal. There's like these spirits that get inside, and these plants help to pull out those spirits. So it's the fragrance of the plant more than any than any chemical property. Odors are chemicals, but it's not so much that you're ingesting the plant to have some physiological reaction. It's that the odors themselves do something to your physiology, to your spirit, mind, body, spirit that gets the thing out. And, in his dream, whether the spirits guided him to that tree or whether it was a subconscious did or the tobacco did, I don't know. But the fact that the plant, it wasn't just some random plant. It was a plant that has an odor. So even the dream inspired plant matches up with this existing systematic and it's an elaborate and very logical. It's very logical. There's a logical theory to how plants expel illnesses. And in each culture, it can be very different, but there's a logic underlying it. And the sensory property was sort of what revealed that logic in most cases. But yet, I don't think it's trial and error at all. I think it's theory testing. I mean, because how could you try if you got a skin sore, you're going to try every plant in the forest? You never, in the Amazon, there's 16,000 plants, you never finish. So they have to be guided by something, and that something is these theories that in most cases are structured through sensory conceptions about the cosmos and about physiology.
Remind me of the idea of energetics, and how and it's like everything has a spirit and everything has like certain energetics to balance. And they talk about energetics a lot in Ayurveda, and these things I study in like my herbalism practice. A lot of
You're an herbalist.
Yeah, a lot of these concepts are like made sense to me, because they're coming from just like old medicinal practices, and so I don't know, it makes sense, like the system of energetics and paying attention to the heat of the illness, and like maybe that has like the odorous plants can contain like diaphoretic herbs, for example, like they heat up the body to expel fevers. So like I think a lot of these things can be understood within those frameworks and like correlates.
And people tend to, doctors and chemists, that's not scientific. It's got to be the alkaloid that affects the whatever receptor. But when people actually start looking at odors, odors enter the body. It's not like the odor is not outside the body. To be perceived, the odor has to. It's the only sense where the sensed whatever object actually enters the body. Everything else is, light striking your eyes, sound vibrations coming in, touch where your skin is reacting. But in the case of the odor, the molecule actually enters your body and interacts directly with the neuron. So, odor is very intimate, and the more recent research on odors has shown that they can activate, the immune system, they can activate, emotional responses, they can activate, mood, depression, stimulation. Odors, they enter the body. You don't ingest them like by drinking, but they enter the body. They're ingested nasally, and they interact with the nervous system, and the nervous system interacts with the limbic system directly. It's the most direct. Most senses takes, I don't know, like 15 or 20 steps before it gets to your brain. The odors is it's like 2 steps, like bang, bang, it's there. So yeah, people think of it as like, oh, wishy-washy, but there's some heavy-duty physiology as well. And the other stuff, maybe in the end, those things are closer to each other than we think about. Spirit and body.
Do you think that this has been kind of correlation between plants and humans? As you always mentioned, the tobacco receptor that we got only for tobacco.
Yeah.
So you think that it could be?
Well, I mean, humans are pretty late in the scene. Animals, especially insects, have been co-evolving with plants for millions and millions of years. And so I think what happens in a lot of the cases is that humans end up capitalizing on, well, not to use that word, but sort of taking advantage of these chemical defense systems that have been co-evolved with insects and then mammals, especially. First with insects and then more recently with mammals. And then humans, it's 10,000 years. I don't think there's been really time for many things to co-evolve with humans, but tobacco was just sitting there waiting, when does my lottery card come up, and bang, Columbus arrived in 1492. I think the first tobacco plantations in Japan were already registered by the end of the 16th century. So within 80 years, tobacco was being cultivated on a, on an industrial scale in Japan. That's how fast it got out. So yeah, I mean, it had co-evolved, some mammalian co-evolution had happened on a small scale, and humans came in and took advantage of that, and then in some cases multiplied it through domestication and magnified it. How do we check for questions from our other listeners, from our online listeners?
Looks like they all left, but.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I've been seeing it on
There's chats. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, no questions.